They were the undisputed masters of our planet, dominating every nook and cranny for millions of years. But why did they suddenly disappear? What secrets lie behind one of the greatest enigmas in the history of our world? Dinosaurs were majestic creatures. Their reign lasted an eternity on our scale, shaping the world as we know it today. Yet something happened to bring their existence to an abrupt and definitive end. Many theories have been put forward to explain this mystery, which has fascinated minds for generations. Dear traveler, welcome. Today we're going back in time to better understand the catastrophic events that led to one of the greatest mass extinctions in our planet's history. But before we set out on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you and have a great trip! Don't recognize the landscape around you? That's only to be expected. We're still on Earth, yes, but on the Earth of 65 million years ago. Our planet was very different then from what it is today. The plant and animal species that lived there were very different from those we know today. It's fascinating to think that these species, which we've never seen, are in fact our ancestors, or at least life forms closer to their origins than our own. How did they arrive on Earth, and how did they manage to disappear completely from our planet's surface? To understand all this, we need to go even further back in time, to the origins of life on Earth. Perhaps we'll find some clues as to what caused the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. Man has always wondered how life came to be on Earth. The first known traces of life on our planet date back 3.8 billion years. At that time, our Earth presented all the conditions favorable to the appearance of life. In fact, it's these conditions that we're currently looking for on the exoplanets we're discovering, in the hope of one day finding a second Earth. What are these favorable conditions which enabled the emergence of life on Earth? First of all, our planet is located in the habitable zone of its star, the Sun. This means it's neither too close nor too far away. It therefore receives just the right amount of energy from the Sun to maintain ideal temperature conditions for water to remain liquid. This is an important condition, as liquid water played a fundamental role in the emergence of life. It was water that enabled the synthesis of the first molecules of life and their arrangement into living cells. Water is the main constituent of living cells, representing between 70 and 80% of a living being's mass. It contains two molecules essential for forming the more complex molecules of living organisms: hydrogen and oxygen. In addition to this, the Earth has a thick atmosphere that enables the water cycle. For example, gaseous water condenses into clouds and rains back down to Earth, and so on. The Earth also has ideal mass. Its gravitational force is high enough to hold back its atmosphere, but low enough not to hold back too many light particles. The Earth is a telluric planet, with a rocky and therefore solid crust, the lithosphere. Without it, the molecules of life could not settle on the planet's surface and develop. Let's return to our original question. How did life originate? The origin of life lies in liquid water, Several billion years ago, water formed a kind of primordial broth, in which complex molecules were arranged, forming the first living cells. The Earth's primitive atmosphere was made up of gases such as water vapor, hydrogen, methane, hydrocyanic acid, and ammonia. Subjected to intense solar radiation and high temperatures, it produced frequent thunderstorms that struck the surface of the oceans. In 1953, Urey and Miller conducted an experiment to recreate this primitive ocean struck by electrical discharges. In this laboratory ocean soup, they succeeded in creating living organisms related to the first causoids, known from the Precambrian, the first geological era. This is how life would have appeared. It was very different from what we know today. For these primitive life forms living in shallow oceans, oxygen was a poison. The atmosphere, however, was very rich in oxygen and therefore hostile to these first living organisms. This is why they first developed in the water, and why it took multiple transformations of life forms before they could emerge. The first living structures are very simple cells, similar to cyanobacteria. They are indeed living beings, capable of self-regulation and reproduction. These first living things have an anaerobic metabolism, meaning they don't need oxygen or air to develop. Today, the oldest form of life found on Earth corresponds to this description. These are the Hamelin Pool stromatolites in Shark Bay, Australia. They are 3.8 billion years old. A billion years later, the first organisms using solar energy for their development appeared. The process is the same one used by all plants today, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis produces oxygen, which enriches the atmosphere with oxygen and creates the ozone layer. The ozone layer protects the Earth's surface from solar rays, which are dangerous for living beings. A virtuous circle that contributes to the development of life. Thanks to photosynthesis, primitive living beings become aerobic. Breathing replaced fermentation as the mechanism for development. And since respiration releases more energy than fermentation, life was able to take on other forms. The first multicellular living beings appeared 900 million years ago, sponges. The first vertebrates appeared much later, during the Cambrian explosion, some 540 million years ago. Amphibians were the first to emerge from the water and venture into the oxidizing atmosphere. During the next geological era, the Mesozoic, between 240 and 65 million years ago, the single continent of Pangaea opened up. New oceans were created, the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Sea levels were much higher than they are today. To give you an idea, Europe was underwater at the time, forming an archipelago. The oceans were also much warmer. The fauna was very diverse. Large reptiles, marine reptiles, dinosaurs, and flying reptiles dominated the animal world. There were also smaller reptiles, such as snakes, lizards, turtles, and crocodiles, as well as mammals and birds. All these animals, however, were small in size, unable to compete with the large reptiles that dominated the land surface. The oceans, too, concealed an abundance of life, with now extinct marine forms such as ammonites, a type of mollusk. This is more or less what the Earth looked like in the Cretaceous, the last period of the Mesozoic era. we are between 145 and 66 million years old. Pangaea continues to fragment. The South Atlantic Ocean appears. Australia and Antarctica are still united, and North America and Europe are still linked by Greenland. India, on the other hand, has already broken away from Madagascar and is beginning to drift. It would later join Laurasia, a supercontinent that would split just after the Mesozoic to give rise to Eurasia and North America. The fragmentation of continents and the opening up of new oceans radically altered our planet's climate. Whereas at the beginning of the Cretaceous, the Earth had experienced a period of cooling, the climate warmed during this period. At the beginning of the Cretaceous, the climate changed from temperate to warm and humid. At the end of the Cretaceous, average temperatures were above 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, compared with 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit today. So there's no ice at the poles. Global warming also caused sea levels to rise. In the late Cretaceous, between 166 million years ago, sea levels reached 200 to 300 meters above today's levels. This global warming opened the way to new ecological niches. The most striking change of the Cretaceous in terms of living species is the revolution in flowering plants. We tend to associate the Cretaceous with dinosaurs, but the real stars of this geological period are flowering plants, or angiosperms. Flowering plants began to colonize the planet around 130 million years ago, in the second half of the Cretaceous period. This colonization created a veritable ecological revolution, known in scientific jargon as the Cretaceous Terrestrial Revolution. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowering plants dominated terrestrial vegetation. They represented between 50 and 80% of species, whereas at the beginning of the Cretaceous they didn't even exist. Revolution is a well-chosen name. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, terrestrial biodiversity has surpassed marine biodiversity, and it's all thanks to flowering plants. Can you imagine living in a world without flowers? That's what the Earth was like before the angiosperm plant revolution. Dinosaurs appeared 230 to 240 million years ago, in the Triassic period, at the beginning of the Mesozoic. At first, they lived in a world without flowers. Until the beginning of the Cretaceous, our planet was mostly populated by conifers, ferns, and cycads. It was during the Cretaceous period, therefore, that flowering plants spread rapidly across the planet's surface, displacing these primitive plant species. Angiosperm plants take many different forms: lianas, shrubs, herbaceous plants. The oldest forms found date back 130 million years. They are small, scattered pollens. Traces of them have been found in Europe, in sediments in Italy and England. In China, a fossil of Archifructus lianarensis, a small flowering plant dating back 127 and 124 million years, has been found. In Spain, a fossil of Montesecchia vidali has been found, dating back 130 million years. In fact, numerous fossilized impressions of leaves, fruit, twigs, and silicified wood have been found. These clues have enabled researchers to reconstruct the history of these flowering plants. Between 115 and 90 million years ago, leaf vegetation changed. This is not just a detail, but an important evolutionary adaptation. This new morphological feature facilitates the circulation of elements produced by photosynthesis, as well as transpiration. In other words, flowering plants are better adapted to photosynthesis and can therefore develop and therefore reproduce faster. Angiosperm plants have played a major role in the diversification of species. The flowers, fruit, seeds, broad leaves, and wood of these new plants provide a wide variety of food for insects, mammals, and reptiles. Now you understand why the second half of the Cretaceous period saw an explosion in biodiversity. The Cretaceous saw the development of numerous groups of animals, dinosaurs, but also reptiles such as crocodiles, lizards, and snakes, mammals, and insects. Flowering plants have also profoundly altered the Earth's climate, notably via the water cycle. Today, angiosperm plants account for 85% of all vascular plant species. They are essential to the maintenance of our terrestrial ecosystem. They provide food for animals. Plants are at the base of the Earth's food chains. Flowering plants first revolutionized the world of insects. Certain insect species present in the Jurassic became extinct, and new pollinating insects were born. Insects were present long before the Cretaceous. In fact, their history goes back over 400 million years. Insects are descended from a very ancient phylum of animals known as arthropods. Arthropods are thought to have appeared around 550 million years ago. So what did insects' ancestors look like? Their bodies are encased in a carapace, and their more or less flexible exoskeletons are equipped with joints. Above all, arthropods were the first living creatures since the dawn of life to be equipped with legs. Today, some of the oldest fossils of these insect ancestors are trilobites, arthropods just a few centimeters long that lived on the ocean floor between 550 and 250 million years ago. Trilobites resemble today's sow-bugs. There were more than 20,000 different species, perhaps even more. What's special about them? They were the first to have multifaceted eyes. "450 million years ago, arthropods began to emerge from the water. The first to free themselves from the marine environment were millipedes, members of the myriapod family, a sub-branch of the arthropods. They were the first animals to settle permanently on continents. But they weren't the first living creatures. They had been preceded by plants, which provided them with choice food. The first known insects date back 425 million years, well after fish, but well before dinosaurs, which only appeared 230 million years ago. Insects have inherited many features from their arthropod ancestors: the exoskeleton, articulated limbs, and faceted eyes. Their bodies are divided into three parts: the head, the thorax with 3 pairs of legs, and the abdomen. Like myriapods, they settled on land and spread rapidly across the entire surface of the Earth. Today, they account for 2/3 of all known living organisms. Insects began to develop wings 320 million years ago. At that time, they had 3 pairs of wings, one for each segment of the thorax. Today, most insects have 2 pairs of wings. There are even some insects, such as flies and mosquitoes, where only 1 pair of wings is functional. Other insects have completely lost the wings of their ancestors. The major orders of insects appeared very early in the evolutionary history of insects. Beetles appeared 300 million years ago, followed by Hymenoptera and Diptera 250 million years ago, and butterflies, or Lepidoptera, 150 million years ago. In fact, 100 million years ago, shortly after the flowering plant revolution, all the modern insect families already existed, which was far from being the case for vertebrates. Bees appeared around 100 million years ago. Butterflies and wasps were already present before the flowering plant revolution, but they evolved with the appearance of these new plants. They acquired new characteristics, better adapted to their new environment. For example, horns replaced the mandibles of butterflies so that these insects could suck nectar from flowers. New behaviors were born. As the plant world became more complex, it was once again a simple question of adaptation. Insects such as ants and termites, known as eusocials, began to form colonies organized into complex societies, with castes and reproductive and non-reproductive individuals. Other insects developed mimicry strategies to escape predators, such as dragonflies and stick insects, whose oldest fossil was discovered in China 126 million years ago. Insects are not the only animal species to have been disrupted by the ecosystem changes that took place during the Cretaceous. The separation of continents and the revolution in flowering plants led to the diversification of environments, and with them of all species. Like insects, dinosaurs had to adapt to new environments. By the Cretaceous, dinosaurs were everywhere on the Earth's surface. Different species can be distinguished according to their living environment. For example, tyrannosauroids, carnivorous theropods, lived in Asia and North America. Abelisaurids live in India, Africa, Europe, and North America. The ceratopsians, large crested horned herbivores, live in Laurasia. The best known of these dinosaurs is the Triceratops. As for the large titanosaurs, the only sauropod representatives at the end of the Cretaceous, they are rare in Laurasia and can be found in Europe, South America, and Africa. Titanosaurs can measure up to 30 meters in length, depending on the species. The best known is Argentinosaurus. Studies carried out in the south of France have shown that in the Maastrichtian, the last stratigraphic stage of the Cretaceous, there was a renewal of species. In other words, during the last few million years of the Cretaceous, dinosaur species were renewed just before their final extinction. This major diversification of dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous is again attributed to the ecosystem change that took place during this period, and particularly to climate change. At the beginning of the Maastrichtian, the climate was rather tropical, or even subtropical, whereas in the upper Maastrichtian, it became more temperate. At the same time, sea levels dropped significantly. The sauropods, quadrupedal herbivorous dinosaurs, and the great titanosaurs underwent what is known as an evolutionary radiation, or evolutionary explosion. This phenomenon is in fact a divergence from a single ancestor. It contributes to the evolution of a species. Other, more recent dinosaurs have undergone significant expansion. These include the Hadrosaurus and Ceratopsian, two groups of dinosaurs with efficient jaws, well adapted to new food resources. In fact, the number of dinosaur species increased steadily before their extinction. According to various studies, there were almost 100 species of dinosaurs living on Earth at the end of the Cretaceous, just before the catastrophe. Dinosaurs were thus numerous, with very diverse species capable of adapting to a wide variety of environments, and present all over the Earth's surface. This makes the mystery of their disappearance all the more elusive. But these are not the only animals present on our planet in the Cretaceous. Birds have also recently appeared on the Earth's surface. The first known representative of birds is Archaeopteryx. It is thought to have lived at the end of the Jurassic period, some 150 million years ago. By the time we enter the Cretaceous period, when flowering plants have yet to colonize the Earth, birds already exist. Surprisingly, researchers believe that birds are related to dinosaurs, but they didn't disappear at the end of the Cretaceous. So in a sense, they are the only dinosaurs to survive the Cretaceous extinction. According to the vast majority of paleontologists, birds are direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs. Theropod dinosaurs are carnivorous bipedal dinosaurs, such as Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor. Archaeopteryx had hybrid characteristics of both species. In addition to its aerodynamic feather-covered wings, it had jaws with sharp teeth, a large bony tail, and claws on its forelimbs. During the Cretaceous period, before the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs, birds diversified. Prehistoric birds now dominate the Earth's population. Most Cretaceous birds are now extinct, as fossils found all over the world from Spain to China testify. But there are also a few modern birds, which appeared during the Cretaceous period. The oldest ancestor of modern birds to have been discovered dates from just before the crisis, 66.7 million years ago. Its fossil was found on the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. Its name? Asteriornis maastrichtensis. $66.7 million years ago, this bird roamed the prehistoric coastline of a shallow sea covering present-day Belgium. The climate was similar to that found on tropical beaches such as those in the Bahamas. Asteriornis maastrichtensis was a long-legged shorebird resembling our modern chickens or ducks. It probably knew how to fly. Other fossils of modern birds from the late Cretaceous period have been found, this time in the southern hemisphere. These include the bones of the duck-like Vegevus found in the Antarctic Peninsula. Birds and non-avian dinosaurs did indeed cohabit, but it was only at the end of the Cretaceous period that modern birds made their appearance, just before a mysterious event caused the disappearance of the dinosaurs, but not the birds. During the Cretaceous period, birds and insects competed for the skies with another kind of flying animal, the pterosaur. The pterosaur is a species of giant flightless reptile that appeared in the Upper Triassic. During the Cretaceous period, competing with the first birds, it evolved into truly gigantic forms. One species of pterosaur, the Quetzalcoatlus, could reach 15 meters or 50 feet wingspan. Pterosaurs are sensitive to climatic conditions, particularly storms, and gradually disappeared over the few million years preceding the extinction of the dinosaurs. As we saw earlier, one of the major geological features of the Cretaceous was a high sea level. The Cretaceous was one of the periods with the highest sea levels in our planet's history. Vast areas of land were covered by shallow water. Europe and Africa, for example, were archipelagos of islands rather than continents. Numerous species populated these warm, shallow seas. With global warming, around 140 million years ago, marine microorganisms multiplied, particularly plankton. All living marine species were able to take advantage of this new abundant food supply. By the beginning of the Cretaceous, life abounded beneath the seas. Numerous species cohabited: echinoderms, such as sea urchins and starfish, sponges, invertebrates such as corals, and crustaceans, mollusks, fish. Some species already resemble their modern form, like coral and lobster, but others are very different from those we know today, like ammonites, which have since disappeared. There are also many predators, such as teleost fish, neoselacean sharks, certain gastropods, and crustaceans. These predators are responsible for the disappearance of certain species, such as brachiopods and crinoids, but also for biological modifications through evolution. Bivalve mollusks sink deeper into the sediment to avoid crabs and gastropods. Other species develop shells or spines to protect themselves from predators. In the warm seas of the Cretaceous, we also find rudists, a group of now extinct bivalve mollusks. These mollusks appeared 155 million years ago. Over the next 90 million years, they continued to evolve. Widely distributed throughout the world's warm, shallow seas, rudists are now an invaluable aid in dating geological layers. In the early Cretaceous, all these marine animals cohabited with marine reptiles. Some marine reptile species became extinct in the early part of this geological period, such as the Thalatosuchian crocodiles around 125 million years ago, or the ichthyosaurs a little later, around 90 million years ago. But other species, such as plesiosaurs, were in full expansion before the crisis that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. The best-known plesiosaurs are the elasmosaurs, long-necked giants. Pliosaurs, often confused with plesiosaurs, also flourished in the Cretaceous. They can be recognized by their elongated heads and powerful jaws with rows of sharp teeth. By the end of the Cretaceous, mosasaurs were the kings of the oceans. These mega-predators can reach 15 meters or 50 feet in length, and their powerful jaws measure up to 1.30 meters or 4 feet in length. Mosasaurs can feed on fish, ammonites, and even other marine reptiles. The Cretaceous saw the appearance of modern underwater species such as turtles, first recorded at 100 million years ago. During the Upper Cretaceous, turtles were gigantic, reaching lengths of up to 3 meters or 10 feet, and wingspans of up to 5 meters or 16 feet. Today's leatherback turtles, which can reach 1.65 meters or 5 feet in length and 2 meters or 7 feet in wingspan, already existed in the Cretaceous. The oceans and seas of the Cretaceous were also populated by numerous fish. The group of fish is highly diversified, with predators such as rays and sharks competing with marine reptiles. For example, the giant sharks, Otudus and Scapanorhynchus, could reach lengths of 6 and 5 meters respectively. bony fish appeared around 100 million years ago. Like sharks, some are giants, reaching up to 15 meters in length. This is the case of Leadsictus, which is not a megapredator, however, as it feeds on plankton. Smaller in size, the bony fish and Codus, fossils of which have been found in North America and the Mediterranean, is a formidable predator. It has long, saber-shaped teeth that can skewer other fish or cephalopods. More discreet than dinosaurs, birds, or marine reptiles, mammals were also present in the Cretaceous. They can be found all over the world in a variety of forms and environments. There are insectivorous, vegetarian, and even carnivorous mammals, such as Repenomamus robustus. Astonishing as it may seem, the remains of a herbivorous dinosaur have been found in the stomach of this small possum-sized mammal some 130 million years ago. Mammals remained small animals throughout the Mesozoic. The largest was no bigger than a badger. On average, Mesozoic mammals weighed only a few hundred grams. But during the Cretaceous period, they grew in size and weight. Groups of mammals present before the Cretaceous rapidly diversified, developing strategies for adapting to different environments. At the beginning of the Cretaceous, we have a primitive Earth with a temperate climate, populated by prehistoric creatures. Animals such as dinosaurs, insects, reptiles, and small mammals flourish in a landscape of ferns, cycads, and conifers. During the Cretaceous, the climate changed, the waters rose, and flowering plants invaded the Earth. Species evolved to adapt to a new, warmer and wetter climate. Flowering plants provide new resources for animals. Pollinating insects appear. More and more animals take on their modern form, both under the sea and on the Earth's surface, such as birds, insects, and turtles. The Earth's surface is dominated by giant animals, such as reptiles, dinosaurs, and prehistoric birds. Small mammals remain in the shadow of these giant creatures. Underwater, the same pattern prevails. Megapredators rule the marine world. These giant sea creatures drive the smaller animals into hiding in the depths of the oceans. By the end of the Cretaceous, the climate had become temperate again. Some species have disappeared, like the pterosaurs, but others are thriving, far from suspecting the catastrophe that is about to befall them. "66 million years ago, something caused the disappearance of the non-avian dinosaurs, i.e., all dinosaurs except their winged descendants, the birds. This mass extinction did not only affect the dinosaurs. Many other terrestrial and marine species became extinct at the same time as the dinosaurs. This catastrophe marked the end of the Cretaceous and Mesozoic eras and the beginning of the Paleocene and Cenozoic eras. Impact of a giant meteorite with the Earth? Unprecedented volcanic eruption? A succession of particularly violent volcanic episodes? Extreme climatic cooling? Researchers are wondering how such a mass extinction could have taken place, and above all, why entire species disappeared while others survived. What is certain is that the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis was certainly caused by a combination of several factors. the consequences of which were devastating for biodiversity. The Cretaceous-Paleocene extinction is one of the best-known biological crises of geological time. A true myth, since it led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. It was also one of the most important. But first, why are we talking about a crisis? A crisis is a sudden, short-lived event that brings about change. The Cretaceous-Paleocene extinction fits this description well. As far as we know, there was a brutal event that caused the disappearance of an entire species that had seemed very solid. And even if this change didn't happen overnight, it's true that on a geological timescale, the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis was short-lived. In the space of just a few million years, ammonites, marine belemnites, and dinosaurs completely disappeared. The number of reptile species dropped drastically, and many land reptiles returned to the sea. The reign of the giant land animals that ruled the continents during the Cretaceous came to an end. This crisis marked a real break. The space left vacant by these extinct animals allowed other animals, still present today, to flourish. Mammals, in particular, were able to diversify with ever larger species. The first primates appeared and diversified, leading several million years later to the first anthropoids and then to the first hominids. The break marked by this major geological crisis is reflected in the stratigraphic layers. Studying stratigraphic layers dating back 65 million years, geologists found a significant drop in the amount of calcium carbonate in the sediments. Instead, they found a layer of clay containing a peak of iridium. In other words, iridium in significant and abnormal quantities, even though iridium is a rare element on Earth. As you can see, this is far from the general public's idea of the extinction of the dinosaurs. There was no apocalyptic event that wiped out an entire species instantly. The exact timing of the extinction is a matter of debate. Some theories suggest a rapid extinction over a few years to a few thousand years, while other hypotheses call for much longer periods, on the order of 1 million years. Not all species were wiped out. Many forms of life survived. But the extinction of the dinosaurs was not the only such crisis. During the last 500 million years of the biodiversity boom, the Earth has experienced several similar mass extinctions. The extinction of the dinosaurs wasn't even the biggest crisis. That title goes to the Permian-Triassic extinction, which took place 250 million years ago. Let's take a look at the 5 major biodiversity crises in the Earth's history. Around 445 million years ago, in the Paleozoic era, life was exclusively marine. An intense period of glaciation led to the disappearance of 60 to 70% of the species then present on Earth. This was the Ordovician-Silurian crisis. Around 358 million years ago, still in the Paleozoic era, major climatic variations, combined with a drop in sea oxygenation, led to the disappearance of 75% of species. This was the Devonian extinction. Around 252 million years ago, the Permian-Triassic crisis was the greatest the Earth has ever known. It marks the boundary between the Paleozoic, or primary era, and the Mesozoic, or secondary era. Over 90% of terrestrial and marine species became extinct. Scientists attribute the origin of this crisis to two major volcanic episodes. Around 200 million years ago, the Triassic-Jurassic crisis was the longest. It lasted nearly 17 million years, compared with 1 to 2 million years for the other crises. Atlantic volcanism caused the disappearance of 70 to 80% of the Earth's living species. Finally, the crisis that interests us, the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. It coincides with two major geological events: a major volcanic episode in Deccan, present-day India, and the fall of an asteroid in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Are these two events sufficient to explain the disappearance of the dinosaurs? Which species became extinct during the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis? Scientists have sought to answer this question by observing sedimentation strata. Fossils of non-avian dinosaurs are found almost exclusively below the KPG boundary. Paleontologists therefore believe that dinosaurs became extinct just before or during the event. Almost exclusively because a few non-avian dinosaur fossils have been found above this limit. But these have been attributed to sediment reworking, i.e. erosion brought them to the surface before they were covered by a deposit of more recent sediments. All non-avian dinosaurs thus became extinct with the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. But, contrary to popular belief, dinosaurs were not the only species to become extinct during this geological crisis. Mosasaurs, marine reptiles that lived in the Upper Cretaceous between 82 and 66 million years ago, also became extinct. As we have seen, mosasaurs were the kings of the oceans. Their jaws, equipped with a double row of powerful teeth, would have enabled them to tear apart the equivalent of a whale. The mosasaur is still a relatively unknown species, although the first fossil was discovered in 1764, long before the dinosaurs. The Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis is also thought to have caused the disappearance of plesiosaurs and pterosaurs. Plesiosaurs are also marine reptiles. They can be recognized by their broad, flat, barrel-shaped bodies, long necks, and 4 long fins that serve as paddles. Present in all the Earth's oceans, they are thought to have lived between the end of the Triassic and the end of the Cretaceous. The first plesiosaur fossil was discovered in England in 1821. Pliosaurs are a species of plesiosaur with a shorter neck and could reach gigantic dimensions. It is estimated that they could reach 17 meters or 56 feet. This made them super predators like the Mosasaurus. The Cretaceous-Paleocene extinction also saw the disappearance of the pterosaurs. These animals were the first vertebrates capable of flight, but they are not classified as either dinosaurs or birds. Like dinosaurs, they belong to the broader group of archosaurs, the dominant reptiles which also include birds and crocodiles. They are thought to have lived between the late Triassic and late Cretaceous periods, between 225 and 65 million years ago. Most pterosaurs were quite small. The pterodactyl, for example, was about the size of a pigeon, but some could reach a wingspan of over 10 meters or 33 feet. Quetzalcoatlus, for example, had a wingspan of 15 meters or 50 feet, the size of a small plane. The first pterosaur fossil was discovered in 1784. Thanks to the various fossils, it has been possible to reconstruct their morphology. Pterosaurs had different wings from today's birds. Their wings were formed by a large membrane stretched between the body and the little finger, which was extremely long. The other fingers formed a small hand placed on the wing. Pterosaurs were poor flyers, but very good gliders. Their way of life was quite similar to that of today's birds. Some lived by the sea and fed on fish, while others lived in canyons and on the edge of cliffs. Many plant species also disappeared during the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. The ginkgo, for example, is the only survivor of a plant family that fell victim to this mass extinction, the Ginkgoaceae. This family of trees is the oldest known. It is thought to have appeared over 270 million years ago, some 40 million years before the dinosaurs. In North America, around 57% of plants became extinct during the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. After the crisis, a recolonization of ferns was observed in this part of the world. Towards the end of the Cretaceous, photosynthesizing organisms such as phytoplankton were at the base of the food chain. The extinction of terrestrial plants caused a reshuffling of the herbivorous species that fed on them. As a result, some species that fed on these herbivores also disappeared. This is probably what happened to the Tyrannosaurus, for example. As for marine animals, invertebrates suffered heavy losses, particularly mollusks. Among the species that have disappeared are ammonites, belemnites, rudis, and coccolithophorids, microscopic unicellular algae. As a ripple effect, all the species in the food chain that feed on these shelled animals also became extinct. Ammonites, for example, were the main food of mosasaurs, which may only partly explain their disappearance. There were more extinctions in the pelagic zone than on the seabed. Animals living in the pelagic zone depended almost exclusively on phytoplankton, which was not the case for animals living on the seabed. On the other hand, some species survived the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. These include mammals and birds. Mammals began to diversify around 30 million years before the Cretaceous-Paleocene boundary. Today's mammal groups were already present in the Cretaceous. Monotremes, marsupials, placentals. In addition, there were other groups, such as multituberculates and Gondwanathera. These mammals have since disappeared, but not at the time of the crisis. So of course, these species also suffered losses during the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. But this is a far cry from the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. Curiously, mammals did not experience an explosion of diversification after the crisis, apart from marsupials. And yet, the disappearance of the dinosaurs had left many ecological niches vacant. How did these mammals survive? There are several explanations. Firstly, as we've seen, the mammal species that existed in the Cretaceous were small, comparable to rats. Most were nocturnal insectivores. Their small size and lifestyle could therefore have helped them find shelter in protected environments. But their survival may also have been linked to their developed brains, or the variety of their diet. Among mammals, it was the omnivores, insectivores, and scavengers that survived the extinction, thanks to the availability of their food sources. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, there were no longer any 100% herbivorous or carnivorous mammals. Surviving mammals and birds fed on insects, worms, and snails, which in turn fed on dead plant and animal matter. They therefore survived the collapse of the food chain following the extinction of the dinosaurs. Following the same line of reasoning, we can see that few groups of animals became extinct in watercourses, as they depended more on detritus flowing off the land than on terrestrial plants for food. Among the large reptiles, crocodilians and champsosaurs survived as semi-aquatic animals, having had access to this food source. Similarly, the squamate family, which includes small reptiles such as lizards and snakes, survived extinction. Today, they are one of the most successful groups of animals, with over 6,000 species in existence. They are thought to have survived thanks to their small size, adaptable metabolism, and ability to change habitat to find more favorable conditions. Under the sea, 80% of shark, ray, and cartilaginous fish species have survived. Less than 10% of bony fish families are extinct. How can we explain this mass extinction, this reshuffling of terrestrial and marine biodiversity? Several theories have been put forward, but scientists are leaning towards a combination of several factors. 66 million years ago, two major geological events took place: volcanic eruptions and the fall of an asteroid. But these events alone are not enough to explain such a crisis in biodiversity. The impact of these events remains unclear and is still debated in the scientific community. For some, the asteroid was the driving force behind the crisis. For others, it was the consequences of volcanism. For still others, these two events, in conjunction with other factors, caused the loss of these species. Let's examine these hypotheses one by one to better understand what may have caused this major crisis 66 million years ago. "66 million years ago, the Earth underwent a major climate change. At the beginning of the Cretaceous, the sea began to advance. But the end of the period was marked by a retreat of the oceans, with the immersion of certain lands. This would have led to far-reaching climatic changes, and thus a gradual decline in certain species over the last few million years of the Cretaceous. At the same time, towards the end of the Cretaceous, huge volcanic eruptions took place in the Deccan, in western India today. Researchers have found traces of these volcanic eruptions in this region, the Deccan Traps. The Deccan Traps consist of a stack of lava flows up to 2,400 meters, or 7,900 feet thick. According to scientists, the eruptive episodes occurred repeatedly over a period of 30,000 to 1 million years. The longest would have lasted several years. Volcanic activity is thought to have begun 300,000 to 400,000 years before the Cretaceous-Paleocene boundary, and to have continued for 700,000 years afterwards. The quantities of dust, ash, and CO2 released into the air certainly had an effect on the climate, and therefore on ecosystems. But there are still some unanswered questions concerning the precise effects of this volcanism on biodiversity and the environment. What we do know is that these volcanic episodes must have had a significant impact on climate. We know that the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis was accompanied by significant climate disruption. Could the outgassing associated with volcanism in the Deccan have had such a major impact on the climate at that time? Researchers can't say for sure what caused the climate change, but what is certain is that volcanism was either the trigger for an upheaval or the element that precipitated a change that had already begun. To find out, we've tried to estimate which gases may have been emitted during eruptions and in what quantities. Here's what we found. In the 200,000 years preceding the extinction of the dinosaurs, the quantities of sulfur and fluorine injected into the atmosphere were such that they could well have disrupted the climate globally. Over several decades, there were several very cold volcanic winters, with average global temperatures dropping by 10 degrees Celsius. This climatic instability could indeed have affected various ecosystems by creating environmental stress. The chemical disturbance induced by volcanism in the Deccan Traps could therefore have single-handedly triggered a mass extinction. Aided and abetted by the falling asteroid, which as scientists believe certainly delivered the final blow, for a long time the question was debated. Did the dinosaurs disappear because of a volcanic eruption or a meteorite? Today, both events are thought to have contributed to the mass extinction. In the 1980s, a layer of black clay was found between Cretaceous and Tertiary, or Cenozoic strata, a geological boundary that is clearly visible in certain parts of the globe and which contains an abnormally high level of iridium. As we saw earlier, iridium is a rare element on Earth. Its presence in such large quantities at the Cretaceous-Paleocene boundary has prompted researchers to ask. And yet, there are objects that contain iridium in abundance: meteorites. Researchers have therefore concluded that a meteorite fell to Earth at this time. At the time, scientists were pondering the notion of a nuclear winter. The idea was as follows. If hundreds of nuclear weapons were exchanged in a Third World War, millions of tons of dust would be thrown into the atmosphere. As a result, we'd be plunged into a kind of artificial night, and the atmosphere would cool, leading to a global winter lasting several years. That's nuclear winter. This idea gave rise to the idea of an impact winter, a winter that would have been triggered by the fall of the meteorite at the end of the Cretaceous period. The crater of this meteorite remained to be discovered. A few years later, researchers discovered the Chicxulub crater on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Numerous traces of the impact were discovered, including quartz with impact marks. All of this makes it possible to estimate the diameter of the meteorite at between 10 kilometers and 80 kilometers, or between 6 miles and 50 miles. The date of impact is estimated at the time of the Cretaceous-Paleocene crisis. The asteroid's fall has long fueled popular imagery. It's true that the extinction of an entire species by a falling meteorite has all the makings of a catastrophe scenario. But in reality, the event was not so spectacular. Based on a numerical analysis of various possible scenarios, researchers have concluded that the asteroid's fall alone could not have caused such a biological catastrophe. The impact of the meteorite was nonetheless disastrous. The asteroid's fall led to the sudden disappearance of many animal and plant species, and thus to a sharp drop in the accumulation of organic carbon in the oceans. It also released large quantities of sulfur into the atmosphere, causing temperatures to plummet. The initial cause of the dinosaur extinction was volcanism, as in most of the biological crises that have punctuated our planet's history. But the fall of an asteroid, almost simultaneously with the repeated volcanic eruptions, dealt the final blow, worsening an already critical situation, especially as the asteroid crashed in the worst possible place, according to some researchers. A study published in 2017 claimed that the dinosaurs might not have become extinct if the asteroid had landed in any other part of the world. The collision occurred in the ocean that now borders the city of Chicxulub, causing the release of a phenomenal amount of soot into the atmosphere, resulting in extreme climatic cooling. After the impact, the Earth's temperature would have averaged -10 degrees Celsius to -8 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Fahrenheit to 17 degrees Fahrenheit. However, only 13% of the Earth's surface is made up of rocks likely to cause such a mass extinction, including the Yucatan Peninsula. In fact, it's as if the meteorite had crashed into a petroleum powder keg. The impact caused by the asteroid would have burned up enough oil-rich sedimentary rock to release almost 1.7 billion tons of fine black carbon particles into the atmosphere. Rain quickly cleared the sky of most of the low-level soot, but the damage was done. Some 385 million tons would have continued to circulate in the upper atmosphere, obstructing light from the sun, vital for the vast majority of species. What's more, according to the author of the study, the soot released by the impact would not have been evenly distributed. The northern hemisphere would have cooled more intensely. The southern hemisphere, on the other hand, recovered much faster. Subsequent studies suggest that instead of soot, sulfur was released in huge quantities into the atmosphere, causing extreme climatic cooling. The result is the same. The asteroid fell on a veritable powder keg, and perhaps if it had fallen in another part of the globe, volcanism alone would not have been enough to cause the extinction of the dinosaurs. A dizzying conclusion that shows this mass extinction hung by a thread. The probability of a mass extinction was very low. Species dependent on photosynthesis, such as phytoplankton and land plants, began to gradually die out, rapidly impacting the rest of the food chain. Herbivorous animals began to disappear as the plants they fed on became scarce. Carnivorous animals like the Tyrannosaurus also disappeared when their usual prey, the herbivores, were no longer around. Only omnivores, insectivores, and scavengers survived. After the crisis, once the non-avian dinosaurs had disappeared, what did the Earth look like? In the Paleocene, surviving animals flourished and developed. Turtles, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, birds. Mammals, hitherto hidden in the shadow of giant reptiles, diversified and began to occupy the niches left vacant by the dinosaurs. 22 new orders of mammals appeared in the 10 million years of the Paleocene. Marsupials, insectivores, lemurs and hoofed animals, ancestors of horses, rhinoceroses and camels. For the most part, These were small herbivorous quadrupeds with slender snouts and small cranial volumes. In the early Paleocene, mammals still closely resembled their Cretaceous ancestors. But as time went on, they evolved to larger sizes, although they remained clumsy, unskilled, and rather archaic. It was at the end of the Paleocene, during the Upper Paleocene, that carnivorous mammals such as the creodont developed. The next period, the Eocene, saw the arrival of the largest mammals and birds in Earth's history, such as Gastornis, which weighed between 50 and 100 kilos, or 110 and 220 pounds. During the Paleocene, angiosperm plants continued to colonize the planet. The first forests of deciduous trees appeared, although they remain fairly rare. The Paleocene also marked the final stage in the breakup of Pangaea. Continents and oceans increasingly resembled those we know today. For example, the Paleocene saw the formation of the Rocky Mountains, a 3,500-kilometer-long chain of mountains in North America. Temperatures remain cooler than in the Cretaceous, but warmer than during the rest of the Cenozoic. The climate is subtropical, i.e. hot and humid, with few seasons. This favors the development of flowering tropical forests, rich in palms, conifers, laurels, sycamores, and ferns. A dense, luxuriant vegetation in which mammals flourish. There are even flowers in Alaska. Sea levels are very high. Almost all of Europe is submerged. Our journey through time draws to a close. The extinction of the dinosaurs is one of Earth's greatest biodiversity crises. This episode in our planet's history caused the disappearance of around 75% of the world's species, giving way to the development of new plants and creatures that still exist today. Without this event, the world would not be the way it is today. This period of glaciation eventually came to an end and is thought to have lasted between 1 and 2 million years. It's important to point out that although glaciation was a major cause of the extinction, other factors such as changes in sea level, plate tectonics, and variations in atmospheric CO2 concentration also played a role. The end of the Ice Age is not without consequences. Rising sea levels would have caused the expansion of poorly oxygenated warm waters, leading to further extinctions. If this hypothesis is correct, it could explain why the biological crisis affected bottom-dwelling organisms such as brachiopods, echinoderms, and trilobites, as well as pelagic forms such as graptolites and nautiloids. While the biological crisis is significant, scientists estimate that it affected almost 85% of species. It did not extinguish large groups in their entirety. A few specimens persist and manage to survive despite these changes in their respective biotopes. In fact, we're going to meet a number of them on our Silurian journey. Some species and genera have undergone evolutionary radiation, enabling them to pass the Ordovician stage. Before going any further, I think it's important to make a brief aside about mass extinctions. Biological crises such as the Ordovician Silurian have occurred several times in Earth's history. Some are better known than others, such as the Cretaceous extinction of the dinosaurs, but they are far from the only ones. Life underwent 5 mass extinctions during the Phanerozoic, the eon that stretches from the beginning of the Cambrian 541 million years ago, to the present day. The two most important crises divide this eon into three eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Two mass extinctions occurred during the Paleozoic, at the end of the Ordovician, as just mentioned, and at the end of the Devonian. Contrary to what we sometimes hear, these crises were never brutal. They very often had multiple and combined origins, and these were spread over millions of years. When we talk about mass extinctions, we're talking about major crises. These are the ones we're generally most familiar with, because they have, of course, left their mark on the history of our planet. But that doesn't mean they're the only ones to have occurred. The history of living organisms has been punctuated by less severe crises. In fact, the Silurian had three minor extinctions that can be observed in the ocean. There was the so-called Erravikan crisis 433 million years ago, at the boundary between Landovery and Wenlock, the Mold crisis at the beginning of the Ludlow, and the Lau crisis towards the end of the same period. For the first, scientists believed that the sea was anoxic, i.e., that the concentration of oxygen in the water dropped sharply. For the others, it's the ocean level that's mainly to blame. In 30,000 years, sea level would have risen by 16 meters. This is a very rapid change. Too rapid to give the species dependent on the impacted biotopes time to adapt and evolve accordingly. To conclude the chapter on geology and geography in the Silurian era, the most important thing to remember is that the Earth underwent considerable changes, notably the melting of the great ice formations, which had major repercussions on the environment and life. These repercussions are sometimes an unavoidable shock for the living world, but are also sometimes synonymous with renewal, diversity, and development. Fauna underwent a great upheaval following the mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician period. It was even fatal for a large number of species. However, other species managed to survive the extinction. This is the case for certain species, such as certain members of the trilobites. After the major biological crisis that hit our oceans, life is finally returning to normal. Of course, this process takes time. Biodiversity has been greatly weakened, and it will take tens of thousands of years to restore the balance. After the crisis, another event will shake things up a bit and give a little boost to the order of living things. A warmer climate will lead to the melting of certain ice caps and higher ocean temperatures. These elements will then be conducive to the development of tabulate corals, hexacoralliarids and tetracoralliarids, as well as algae and stromatopores. On the subject of stromatopores, until a few years ago they were classified as belonging to the order of corals. They were thought to be closely related to the millipore, the hydrocorallia. However, according to the latest findings from fossil analyses of these organisms, they are more likely to be classified as sponges. Each of these species, from corals to algae and sponges, contributes to the construction of large reefs, particularly on intertropical plateaus. We'll soon be taking a closer look at reefs. Let's stay on the surface for a moment. Even today, reefs are teeming with life and form one of the essential pillars of many marine ecosystems. In Silurian times, this was also the case for many organisms. Reefs were home to a large number of species, providing food for other animals higher up the food chain. Speaking of the food chain, there's another element besides the reef that we sometimes forget to mention, when we think of ocean ecosystems: plankton. Despite its small size, it's a very important element. The food chain is one of the building blocks of an ecosystem. Everyone has a place and a role to play in this ecosystem. Whether predator or prey, each species counts for the survival of all. Today, as in the Silurian era, the base of the marine food chain is made up of plankton. In fact, during this third Paleozoic era, phytoplankton and zooplankton were already present in the vast ocean. For the record, phytoplankton are all unicellular organisms present in the surface waters of the ocean and using photosynthesis as a source of energy. Zooplankton are animal plankton that feed directly or indirectly on phytoplankton. The Silurian period saw the appearance of Urnocchitina, Urna, and Fungochitina kosovensis, two marine plankton. In biology, they are known as chitinozoans. Like all marine species, phytoplankton and zooplankton were severely affected by the biological crisis at the end of the Silurian, but some have survived and even evolved. Until the beginning of the Ordovician period, graptolites belonged to the dendroid group, i.e. organisms with a planktonic lifestyle. But this was no longer the case. After undoubtedly passing through a pseudoplanktonic phase, a few million years later, they finally formed a class of colony-dwelling animals belonging to the Hemichordata phylum. Graptolites are rather strange colony-dwelling creatures floating in the water. These small marine organisms are colonial animals gathered around a main stem, with one individual serving as the central base, to which are attached small cells where each specimen lives. A real structure develops around it, forming a sort of living bell suspended in the water. But they can also cling to algae and form their colony around this attachment point if conditions require it for survival. Another important point to remember about graptolites is that they are stratigraphic. In other words, they enable us to situate sedimentary layers in time. The Llandovery period saw the appearance of Parachitograptus, Achaemanatus, and Achidagraptus ascensus. During the Wenlock, Cirtograptus centrifugus marks the beginning of the period. This is followed by Neo-Diversograptus nilsoni in the Ludlow period and Monograptus perultimus in the Pridolian. In 2015, a study carried out on fossil plankton dating back some 415 million years unlocked a number of mysteries, including some of the causes of mass extinction. Paleontologists have also noted a high proportion of malformed, so-called teratological individuals in fossil phytoplankton and zooplankton in sedimentary layers dating from the Ordovician Silurian period. These correspond to the initial stages of extinction events. After analysis, it turns out that these microorganisms contain a form of heavy metal pollution. Today, we know only too well the extent to which heavy metals have a negative impact on plankton. Scientists are well aware of the teratological effects of these metals. Toxins cause morphological abnormalities in aquatic organisms, and the presence of malformed individuals even serves as a tool for detecting possible contamination. Measurements of metal concentrations in some of these fossil specimens, as well as in the rocks surrounding them, reveal high concentrations of iron lead and arsenic. The abundance of these heavy metals in the fossils and rocks, combined with a high presence of teratological forms, suggests that the metals were absorbed by the organisms when they were alive and deposited in the surrounding sediments. While not the sole and principal cause of the major extinction, heavy metal pollution remains a contributing factor to the extinction phenomenon. Maybe it's time for us to go and meet some larger marine animals, don't you think? A few mollusks, some brachiopods, and many fish would like to testify to their history. What all these species have in common is the aquatic world. The fauna is almost exclusively marine, and in the end quite similar in all four corners of the globe. Some species settle in coastal regions, others prefer deeper waters. During the Ordovician period, we observed several species of mollusk. This large family continued to evolve during the Silurian. These, like the nautiloids, prefer coastal areas and shallow waters. Thanks to the sunlight penetrating the water, we should be able to see several fine specimens of these small marine organisms. I told you just now that many mollusks continued to evolve after the Ordovician during the Silurian. This means that a small handful did not. Not all nautiloids continued their development after the Ordovician. Giant nautiloids, for example, are less and less present in the Silurian. They survived the Ordovician, but during the Wenlock, the second period of the Silurian, they eventually became extinct, as in the case of the Camarasaurus genus. Other nautiloids diversified several million years ago, and the climatic and environmental conditions of the Silurian favored their development and diversification. Nautiloids include straight, curved, and even spiral shells. Not only did they survive the Ordovician crisis, but they also made it through the Cretaceous crisis unscathed, as the Nautilus and Allonautilus genera still exist today. Nautiloids belong to the tetrabranchial class of cephalopod mollusks, i.e. they have 4 gills. They live exclusively in open water. Nautiloid cephalopods have a distinctive shell. It spirals in a single plane. Inside there are several compartments, loges separated by partitions. The animal lives in the last compartment, called the living chamber. Although the animal only lives in one chamber, the other chambers are still useful. Each of these chambers contains a mixture of water and gas. Our little nautiloid is able to manage the volume of this mixture in the chambers thanks to the siphon that runs through them, allowing it to rise or fall deeper into the water. Most nautiloids are scavengers or opportunistic predators. In other words, they don't play hard to get and take what comes their way. During the previous period, the Ordovician, one nautiloid genus in particular had its heyday, Orthoceras. They were alpha predators, predators at the top of the food chain. But the giant Orthoceras will soon have to learn to be on its guard. Eurypterids made their grand entrance during the Silurian period. Here we see a Eurypterid, Acaturamus. It won't hesitate to attack the giant nautiloid if hunger strikes. But we'll have the chance to meet this new predator of the deep blue later on. In the Silurian, new genera of these cephalopods are also appearing, such as Pismoceras. Their shells are no longer completely planispiral, i.e. spiral-shaped on a single plane. The inner towers are detached from the outer towers. The Phragmoceras genus also boasts a rather singular morphology. with its shell shaped like a Phrygian cap. Phragmoceras, Eurystoma, and Phragmoceras dubium can be seen here. Phragmoceras is a nautiloid cephalopod mollusk with a distinctive curved shell in the shape of a Phrygian bonnet, rather than a coiled shell of today's nautilus, with almost two openings, one for the head and the other for the siphon. Among cephalopods, Actinoceratidae can also be found with a straight phragmocone. The phragmocone is the equivalent of the ostracum in other mollusks. It forms the partition part of the cephalopod shell. These mollusks have lived alongside other cephalopods, such as Ascoceratidae, Discosauridae, Oncoceratidae, and Tarphoceratidae, whose spirally wound phragmocones are capable of floating. They also have a large siphon. Among the Discoracidae, it is interesting to observe one of the members of the genus, Gomphoceras. Unlike the other animals we saw, it too has a rather unusual shape. Most of the animal remains enclosed in the shell, leaving the tentacles and funnel to pass through. Its shape is convex and elongated, rather like a drop of water. Orthoceratidae can also be seen. They have a straight or slightly arched phragmocone. The siphon is narrow and variable in position, either straight or ringed. The cephalopods we've just discovered enjoy reefs and life in the shallow waters of our oceans, but so do brachiopods. Mollusks may be present, but brachiopods are in the majority and populate the Silurian oceans more widely. In a few million years' time, the balance will tip in the opposite direction. There will be fewer brachiopods and more mollusks during the Devonian. To give you an idea of this reversal, in the seas of the Primary Era, there were around 50 brachiopods for every bivalve. Today, there are far fewer brachiopods, with an estimated 1 brachiopod for every 50 bivalves. Brachiopods are marine animals that bear a striking resemblance to bivalves due to their two-valved shells. Without a little knowledge of the subject, they could easily be confused. In fact, these two groups are quite different in anatomy, and unlike bivalves, brachiopods are not mollusks. They are a group that belongs to the Lophophorians. This group also includes the Bryozoa and Phoronidia. Brachiopods are placed in the phylum Lophophorians because it is a phylum of invertebrates that possess a lophophore. A lophophore is a ciliated apparatus that plays both a feeding and a respiratory role. It is this common characteristic that brings the bryozoans we have mentioned and the brachiopods together in the same class. The Paleozoic is the golden age of brachiopods, as it was during this long period that they were the most numerous and diverse. Although we still have many brachiopod specimens in our seas, as we have just mentioned, they remain less numerous than they were millions of years ago. These marine animals have a benthic or sessile lifestyle, which means they live attached to the seabed. To better understand these small animals, it's important to know that a benthic lifestyle means that the organisms live attached to the ground or move by skimming the bottom. They find their food in the sediment and thus depend on it for their sustenance. A sessile lifestyle, on the other hand, defines a lifestyle in which the organism is permanently attached to the substrate, i.e. the soil where it grows or develops. This is the case, for example, of sponges and corals. There are two types of valve articulation, the main criteria for classifying this marine group: articulated brachiopods and inarticulated brachiopods. During the Silurian, articulated brachiopods diversified considerably. Unlike inarticulated brachiopods, the shells of articulated brachiopods remain fused even after the animal has died. Articulation is made possible by the presence of teeth on one valve, the peduncular valve, and dimples of complementary shapes on the other valve. Their two-valve shell is said to be asymmetrical and can be attached to the substrate. The larger valve is called the peduncular or ventral valve. The smaller one is commonly referred to as the dorsal or brachial valve. To attach itself, the brachiopod had a peduncle attached to an orifice called the foramen. At the commissure, the joint between the two shells, we can see a wavy shape running along the edges. It is precisely these small undulations that differentiate brachiopods from bivalves, where the commissure is smooth. Silurian brachiopods include Orthidae, Strophimenidae, Pentameridae, Rhynchonellidae, Spiriferidae, and Terbratullidae. The Strophimenidae are an order of articulated brachiopods that live from the lower Ordovician to the middle Carboniferous periods. They are part of the extinct class of Strophimenata, which was the largest known order of brachiopods, encompassing over 400 genera. All these small marine animals roam a rich seascape that supports the development of biodiversity. As you can see, this landscape is very varied in shallow waters. You can even see some very unusual animals. Sea lilies, also known as crinoids, populate Silurian oceans, as do scyphocrinites, elgans. Like sea urchins and starfish, they belong to the echinoderms. They first appeared in the Ordovician period, but expanded greatly in the Silurian. They still exist today. Because of their shape and name, they are often mistaken for sea flowers, but they are really limestone animals, not plants. Take a closer look at Scyphocrinites elgans and you'll see what I mean. It has pinnules at the top of its articulated arms, a kind of small feather that enables it to capture plankton. The arms are grouped together and attached to the central part, the calyx, which itself rests on the stem. At the end of this stem, the sea lily has spikes. These hold it in place on the ground. Other similar animals have found their way to the seabed. Karyocrinites, for example, are also echinoderms, and they are expanding rapidly. Here you can see a Karyocrinites ornatus. These coral reefs have gradually become established, particularly in the Lapitous Ocean, between Proto-Gondwana and Laurasia. They have become the preferred home of the nautiloids we saw, as well as brachiopods. A little further on, we can see the famous Ordovician trilobites, which have diversified considerably since their appearance, a few million years ago. For all these little animals, these reefs at the bottom of the ocean could have been like paradise. But that was without counting on the arrival of a larger arthropod, the Eurypterid. Eurypterids are undoubtedly the most emblematic species of the period, and for good reason. The Silurian is known as the golden age of these sea scorpions. You have to imagine that these arthropods can reach absolutely extraordinary sizes, like this Eurypterid, Pterygotus. It is almost 2 meters long. During the Silurian period, it was the largest predator on the planet. No living organism rivals it in size or power. As a result, it quickly became a formidable predator, rising to the top of the food chain. More than 100 different species of Eurypterid are thought to have existed. They varied in size, but the largest specimens could reach between 2 meters 50 and 3 meters 60, or between 8 and 12 feet. This group includes Eurypterus, Megalograptus, and Pterygotus, which we have just seen. As we said earlier in our trip, the Eurypterid is a marine arthropod. Morphologically, it resembles a scorpion, hence its nickname sea scorpion. It is related to arachnids and crustaceans. Although closely related to the scorpion, the horseshoe crabs we still encounter today are their closest cousins. The Eurypterid belongs to the meristome group, like horseshoe crabs, and not to the arachnid group like scorpions. The Eurypterid is easy to identify. It can be recognized by its elongated body and large articulated tail. Its sting is visible at the end of the tail. However, unlike the scorpions we know today, it turns out that this sting contained no venom. At least that's what we know today. The Eurypterid also has a pair of fin-like legs and giant sharp pincers. These are highly efficient at cutting and crushing prey. While some species of this genus were undoubtedly opportunists, feeding on corpses found here and there on the ocean floor, other Eurypterids were fine predators. Their size was an asset, and to reach such dimensions, the environment and living conditions had to be right. At that time, oxygen levels were higher. Experiments have shown that the richer the oxygen content of the aquatic or terrestrial environment, the larger the insects, and in our case, the Eurypterati. As we just mentioned, Eurypterids were among the largest predators of their time, and quickly rose to the top of the chain. They hunted trilobites in deep water. Trilobites look a bit like aquatic sobugs. What applies to Eurypterids in terms of size also applies to trilobites. There were species as small as a few millimeters, but also some very large specimens. Some were as much as 75 centimeters or 30 inches long. So predators adapted to this type of morphology were needed. Their rigid dorsal carapace, rich in calcium carbonate, fossilized easily, hence their abundance in sediments. On the other hand, the underside and appendages are rarely preserved, and are known from only a dozen or so species. Eurypterids and trilobites have another thing in common. Like all arthropods, they grew throughout their lives by successive molts. If Eurypterids were formidable predators, it's because they were perfectly equipped to become the greatest marine predators of their time. Many marine animals with tails can only move them horizontally. In sea scorpions, the tail was virtually inflexible horizontally, but highly mobile vertically. According to the researchers, sea scorpions were thus able to bend their tails and project them far onto their targets. They would assault and kill their prey with lateral attacks using their toothed tails. This is what the recent study of a fossilized specimen, that of Slimonia acuminata, has revealed. Eurypterids have been numerous and highly diversified over the years, but they have also evolved. Soon, in the Carboniferous period in particular, Eurypterids such as Adelophthalmus pyrrhae were able to breathe in the open air, whereas until then they had been aquatic specimens. Their shells were also able to withstand atmospheric pressure in the open air. In other words, from time to time they might be able to get onto dry land without any difficulty at all. For now, we're going to continue our journey into the open sea to discover the many other species that inhabit the vast ocean. Yes, we haven't had time to meet any fish yet, but as you'll see, the history of this group during the Silurian period is full of twists and turns. Fish evolved a lot, especially at the end of the Silurian. But let's take a step back to better understand these changes. The first chordate organisms appeared in the Cambrian. It was from this chord that the vertebral column was derived, to which muscles could be attached, giving them greater mobility. During the Ordovician period, organisms such as Sacabambaspis, Arandaspis, and Astraspis developed an exoskeleton. This external carapace protected the anterior part of their body, leaving the posterior part flexible to facilitate movement of their only limb, their tail. They were thus the first craniites to appear. Crania are the clade of animals with a cartilaginous or bony skull, protecting the anterior part of the nervous system. They belong to the ostracoderms. With no lateral fins, they use only the power of their tails to navigate the ocean floor. The evolution of fish had pretty much come to a halt here at the end of the Ordovician period. Although there were a few outlines of evolution, they were mainly fixed and developed in the Silurian. Several groups of fossil vertebrates with mineralized skeletons but no jaws are known. These groups, also known as ostracoderms, are the Aranidaspids, Astraspids, Heterostracans, Anaspids, Galeaspids, Pituriaspids, Osteostracans, and Thelodonts. Let's take a moment to differentiate some of these major groups in Silurian fishes. First of all, let's review some basic fish vocabulary. Ostracoderm fish are essentially bottom-dwelling fish with massive bony armor. They are also often referred to as agnathans or jawless fish. Agnathans, the jawless fish that appeared discreetly in the Ordovician period, diversified. Alongside the common-shaped anaspids, we find groups with increasingly varied shapes. The dart-shaped Heterostracans, the ray-like Osteostracans, and the more pot-bellied Thelodonts. Let's start with the anapsids, and to discover this group we're going to look at an exceptional member, Burkinia. It's a little shorter than the others, measuring around 10 centimeters or 4 inches. Like the others, however, it has neither jaws nor fins. It is also distinguished by a complex set of dorsal scales. Anapsids generally have 6 to 25 gills, but the Burkinia genus has 30. This one is a Burkinia elegans. It's probably a filter feeder. Ostracoderms are, so to speak, the most advanced of the agnathans. Although they still have a long way to go, these fish are increasingly well adapted to their environment and equipped to defend themselves against predators. Among the members of the anapsids, the anaspid Pharyngolepis oblongus stands out. It has no facial shield, but a rather elongated shape with a well-developed anal fin. It measures between 10 and 25 centimeters, 4 and 10 feet. Among the telodonts, we could go and meet the telodont Loganellia scotica, an agnathus measuring around 25 centimeters or 10 feet. It has no scales but plate armor. We can see that it's more paunchy and quite different morphologically from the anapsids, despite their few similarities. Another genus stands out from the others, the heterostracans. Heterostracans have an anterior dermal shield and scales on their body and tail. As you can see, the front of these fish is very pronounced. They are shaped like arrows or horseshoes at the front. Heterostracans are agnathic vertebrates. They can be recognized by their single-bone facial shield. This is known as the anterior dermal shield. This no longer grows once the animal reaches adulthood. Another distinctive feature is their flattened body, with a mouth on top of the head and scales covering the body and tail. Their closest relatives today are hagfish. One of the Silurian specimens is the Pteraspis. This fish has a double shield of dorsal and ventral plates. It also has a rostrum, an elongated appendage that some animals, both vertebrates and invertebrates, can have, such as the saw shark. Although it doesn't really have fins as such, the Pteraspis has a lobed tail, a carapace, and a rostrum that make it very aerodynamic underwater. And then, if you look a little closer, you'll notice that its carapace has a few wing-like protuberances on the sides, which also enable it to compete with the best Silurian swimmers. The spine you see on the back of its carapace isn't very useful for swimming, but it was undoubtedly very useful for warding off predators. Pteraspis' favorite food is plankton. It therefore lived on the surface rather than in the depths. During the Silurian period, there were several species of Pteraspis, including Pteraspis croci and Pteraspis rostrata. One fish bears a close resemblance to Pteraspis, a close cousin, so to speak. It's the Rhinopteraspis dunensis. You'll notice that, like it has a carapace, a rostrum, and defensive spines on its back. Both measure between 20 and 30 centimeters. Earlier, we also mentioned galeaspids. These fish also belong to the agnathan group. They are primitive fish that had neither fins nor jaws. One member of the genus is called shuyu, Jejiengensis. Here is another member of the group, Laxaspis. The distinctive head armor is still recognizable. Our little sojourn with the agnathans is drawing to a close, but our journey with the fishes is not over yet. Indeed, the evolution of these fish is not the only great revolution concerning them. One of the great events of the Silurian period was the arrival of jawed fish, the gnathostomes. Their jaws were formed from the second branchial arch of agnathans. The first jawed vertebrates, or gnathostomes, were the spiny-finned acanthodians and the placoderms, which enclosed the front of their bodies in a bony carapace. The acanthodonian, Climatius reticulatus, was one of the first jawed vertebrates. It is easily distinguished by the small ventral spines that support its fin. Acanthodians are evolutionarily unusual in that they combine the characteristics of bony fish, osteichthyans, and cartilaginous fish, chondrichthyans, During the Ordovician period, the oceans were populated by so-called ostracoderms, armored fish with a dermal bone armor. As we have seen, these fish also belong to the agnathans. They were still widely present in the Silurian, but at the end of the Ordovician and beginning of the Silurian, the arrival of placoderm fish, and above all, gnathostome fish, i.e. fish with jaws, completely overturned the marine world. But don't make any wrong assumptions. Jaws do not necessarily mean teeth. The placoderm fish group has undergone two major revolutions. Unlike ostracoderms, they had an articulated armor, mainly on the front of the body, composed of plates reminiscent of turtle shells. The other strong point of these fish is, of course, their jaws. Their jaws end in bony outgrowths. This type of jaw can also be seen in modern turtles. We'll have to wait a little longer to see real teeth in fish. Nevertheless, this primitive jaw remains powerful and perfectly suited to the task of predation. What's more, even if the teeth haven't fully erupted yet, we can see bony outgrowths that are undoubtedly the first signs of this biological evolution. Placoderms are referred to as gnathal plates rather than teeth, with the upper, supraognathal plate resting on the lower, infraognathal jawbone. This set of plates with their occlusal zones acted like scissors. This is particularly true of the fish we're looking at here, Entelognathus primordialis. It has several fins, a long tail, and a very distinctive face. It's the first to display what resembles a face, with its distinctive position of eyes, nose, and mouth. When you observe an ostracoderm, such as the anaspid, Pharyngolepis oblongus, and a placoderm such as Entelognathus primordialis, you'll notice that there are several other very distinct differences between these two groups of fish. Firstly, the placoderm's armor is no longer only on the head, but all along the body. Scales are also clearly visible. Morphologically, the most striking feature is undoubtedly the presence of fins. These fish have real limbs expressly designed for swimming. This group is therefore undergoing a major evolutionary process. With the appearance of fins, placoderm fish are able to move more precisely, swimming better and faster. Its carapace protects it from other marine animals, and above all, it acquires a powerful jaw, capable of defeating its prey, making it a good marine predator. To conclude on the hatching of the gnathostomes, it should be noted that this group gave rise sometime later to two major groups that we still know today: the cartilaginous fishes and the bony fishes. The analysis of an Entelognathus primordialis fossil turned all our beliefs and knowledge about fish classes and evolutionary theories on their head. Until the discovery of Entelognathus, it was considered that the placoderm skeleton had nothing to do with that of bony fish, and that the two had appeared separately. It was therefore thought that cartilaginous fish, similar to rays and sharks, had given rise to bony fish. But Entelognathus has small cranial bones and jaw bones. Placoderms are therefore the direct ancestors of modern fish. Vertebrates were undoubtedly endowed with a bony skeleton from the start. Indeed, the external dermal bones they possess are similar to those of osteichthyans, so they probably have the same origin. This means that the evolutionary position of sharks has changed dramatically. This revelation refines our knowledge of a whole area of paleobiology. Fossils still have much to teach us. Discoveries such as these shed a little more light on our distant past. Let's leave placoderms for a completely different kind of fish. Even if they don't belong to the gnathostomes per se, it would be interesting to meet some conodonts. These very special fish certainly have a lot to teach us and help us discover. The genus Wormelia, for example, particularly Wormelia inflata, was present in the oceans of the Paleozoic era. These animals are rather difficult to describe and rather unusual, even frightening despite their small size. They don't have jaws, yet they have small teeth. It may seem paradoxical, but they're not the only animals to have teeth but no jaws. This is the case of hagfish and lampreys, for example. Hagfish are necrophagous and lampreys parasitic. A 2012 study published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B sheds some light on this animal, which is certainly a vertebrate, and its mode of nutrition, since it possessed a rather original teething system. According to the study, the scientists, a group of British and Australians, were able to uncover, through tooth wear, the workings of their distinctive dentition. Teeth functioned in pairs, one opposite the other, exerting rotational movements to crush food. Finally, the absence of jaws prevented these fish from exerting strong pressure, but they managed to compensate for the problem with very sharp teeth. After all these marine encounters, we can affirm that even if the Silurian is a short period, it was marked by numerous events and major biological evolutions in the marine world. Marine biodiversity developed and enriched considerably during the Silurian. But what about on land? Terrestrial life is limited to a narrow band of wetlands around rivers and lagoons, but even if it's still limited, it's there. Both fragile and firmly rooted in the soil, it is determined to conquer dry land. But as you can imagine, it didn't all happen in a day. It took several million years to reach the narrow, wet, life-rich Silurian strip of land. After the evolutionary radiation of the Cambrian, also known as the Cambrian explosion, so important was the development of life, and after the Ordovician radiation, which was also very rich and important, the arrival of the first arthropods on Earth is without doubt the most important revolution in the history of life on Earth. It is symbolic. It marks the beginning of all possibilities. Plants were the first to colonize terra firma, as early as the Ordovician period, 470 million years ago, fundamentally altering the geosphere. Oxygenation of the atmosphere, formation of soils, and new climatic and sedimentary regimes. Until then, however, plants were virtually alone in the world. However, mycorrhizae, symbiotic associations between plant roots and soil fungi, not only give plants better access to soil nutrients, but also help to weather the rock. In other words, together they pave the way for a biotope worthy of the name. When arthropods finally land on the continent, they bring with them the very first terrestrial ecosystem. Arthropods were the first animals to take the plunge, along with myriapods and arachnids in the Silurian 430 million years ago. They opened the door to the hexapods, the insects, which in turn landed on land at the beginning of the Devonian, as well as to other animals straight out of the water. In all, 7 arthropod groups independently reached land: myriapods, arachnids, hexapods, and at least 4 crustacean groups, including sobugs and crabs. Vertebrates were therefore the last to colonize continental environments, only at the end of the Devonian. In fact, vertebrates could not have left the water as quickly as arthropods, for the simple reason that the latter were better equipped to cope with the many anatomical and physiological problems of life on land. Arthropods will play an essential role in soil development and the decomposition and recycling of nutrients. To better understand this very first ecosystem, let's go back a few million years to observe the beginnings of the very first plant cover. The oldest fossils of land plants date back to the beginning of the Middle Ordovician period, some 470 million years ago. We're going to find part of the fossil of these first plants, their spores. While the lack of complete fossils limits our knowledge of these early plants, it does enable us to date their appearance. A little later in the Silurian, we began to find fossils of a different kind. This time we can analyze fossil remains of plant stems and roots from around 430 million years ago. These fossils include the first vascular plants, also known as tracheophytes, which transport water and mineral salts throughout the plant. Vascular plants, which produce more acids than algae or lichens and have a much more developed root system, offer a larger contact surface. It is therefore highly likely that they have intensified alteration of the substrate, i.e., the soil in which they grow. With these first plants, the Earth was able to welcome its new inhabitants. Numerous morphological and physiological transformations were required in both plants and animals before living organisms could adapt to life on land. While the aquatic world is not always the most peaceful, life on the surface is harsh and much more unstable. Arthropods, thanks to their rigid shells, have been able to overcome the first difficulty posed by atmospheric pressure on a body, a difficulty that until now was not so problematic since the organisms lived in water. Another problem faced by the Earth's first settlers was reproduction out of water. In the early days, animals living on land still reproduced in an aquatic environment. It wasn't until a few further evolutions, and above all major biological revolutions such as the amniotic egg, that this obstacle was overcome. But we're not there yet. Far from it. Plants first tried to conquer new territories, gradually establishing themselves on the continent during the Silurian period. In previous eras, green algae, cyanobacteria, and lichens had gradually settled on land. Until then, only lichen had managed to make a real place for itself. But in the early Silurian, moss also managed to establish itself. Despite the light presence of this vegetation on the Earth's surface, the landscape remains close to desolation. It's a far cry from a lush forest. However, something is about to change during the Silurian period. Water brought sediments to the coasts, and these sediments were a godsend for certain plants that could cling to the ground while taking advantage of the nearby water. This is how Cooksonia hatches, a plant with a stem and a kind of ball at its tip. Its average height is 10 centimeters or 4 feet. But this height is enough for Cooksonia to spread its spores through the air and reproduce. Soon, Cooksonia is carpeting coastal landscapes. Cooksonia thrives but still encounters some adaptation difficulties. Until now, plants didn't have to withstand atmospheric pressure, or at least through water, they could withstand it much more easily. In the course of evolution, they adopted a new skeleton, better suited to life on land. During the Middle Silurian, another major evolution took place in these plants. They were equipped with stomata, small orifices that enabled them to breathe through the air. In this way, plants will acquire new abilities to adapt to their new environment. In water, nutrients were more readily available. On land, they are faced with rock. To overcome this problem, they acquire rhizomes. These are the beginnings, so to speak, of roots. Thanks to these, they can absorb nutrients from the soil, and above all, redistribute them, even to the plant's highest organs. It was not until a few million years later that plants completed their panoply with outgrowths. These will enable them to capture more of the sun's rays and thus grow. For each plant to succeed, it sometimes had to climb much higher than the others. At that time, ferns were much larger than those we know today, for example. Even if vegetation was still very limited in the Silurian, it still helped new species to flourish. On land, there are indeed some plant species, but also animals that are just beginning their journey on Earth. In the Silurian, vegetation was still in its infancy, but this was enough for myriapods and arachnids such as mites, spiders, and scorpions to adapt to a terrestrial environment. Arachnids form a class of animals that is often confused with and limited to spiders. Although spiders are indeed part of this class, they are not the only members. This class also includes scorpions, mites, ticks, and opilions. What distinguishes this group is that its members have 4 pairs of legs, neither wings nor antennae, and their ocelli, or eyes, are simple rather than compound, as in dragonflies, for example. Arachnids are also arthropods, i.e. they have a segmented body, and are more specifically chelicerae arthropods. They have chelicerae. These chelicerae are appendages close to the mouth that end in hooks or pincers. If you've been paying attention during our trip, this description probably reminds you of our famous Eurypterids. You're quite right to make the connection, as they are both chelicerae arthropods. The arachnid order is included in the class of these chelicerae arthropods. Eurypterids are also included, as they too have mouth-like appendages that end in hooks or pincers. Unlike our first encounter with Eurypterids, this time we're not looking for members of these chelicerae arthropods in the water, but on land. With the help of vegetation, spiders, scorpions, and even myriapods have managed to make a little space for themselves. As you probably know by now, the first clawed arthropods of the chelicerae suborder appeared around 540 million years ago, during the Cambrian, the oldest period of the Paleozoic era. Most adapted to life on land. But during the Silurian period, the first scorpions and spiders settled on the continent, or at least left a trace of their passage on Earth. Yes, let's not forget that distant history is a very special science. scientists rely on current knowledge, technology, and of course, first and foremost, on fossils. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to find remnants of the distant past. Based on analysis of the elements currently in our possession, it appears that the first scorpions and spiders on the continent date back to the Silurian. However, future discoveries may update or refine this information. Among Silurian arachnids, the scorpion genus and the spider genus in particular are found on Earth. Earlier, we met a sea scorpion. This time it's a land scorpion, Paleophonus. The scorpion is about 7 centimeters long. Yes, larger plants and newly enriched soils are enriching biodiversity. We can see spiders, scorpions, and myriapods. Paleophonus, our scorpion, has a way of life that still raises questions. He lived on Earth, that's a fact. At least that's what the fossil evidence suggests. Now, whether it was exclusively terrestrial, mainly aquatic and on dry land at times, or aquatic in its juvenile form and then terrestrial as an adult, the question remains unanswered. The sting at the end of its tail, also called telson, is undoubtedly venomous, unlike the eurypterids we've seen. In the spider, there are clear similarities and differences with the scorpion. In the scorpion, the abdomen extends into a postabdomen called the tail. In the spider, the body is composed of 2 parts, but the head and thorax are combined into a single part, called the cephalothorax. The second part is the abdomen. It is on the cephalothorax that we find the 4 pairs of locomotive legs and the chelicerae. While the finest fossil specimens date from the Devonian, Paleocarinus rhinensis lived on Earth at the end of the Silurian. It belongs to the order Triganotarbida. Spiders of the order Triganotarbidae do not yet have silk-producing spinnerets, unlike the majority of predatory spiders today. Examples include Cryptomartis brebski, Pneumodesmus also lived on Earth at the same time. This time we're dealing with a myriapod. It is undoubtedly the first of this group to take its first steps on the continent. This ancestor of millipedes marks an important stage in the conquest of the terrestrial environment by arthropods, as it is the oldest terrestrial animal discovered to exhibit typical air breathing. The opening of the trachea is visible on the fossil segments found, suggesting a terrestrial life. It would then be necessary to wait patiently for biological evolution to continue before other organisms manage to live on the continent. To conclude our journey into the Silurian, it's worth remembering that this was a transitional period between the Ordovician and Devonian eras. It was a period when plants and certain arthropods finally succeeded in conquering the land, but also when primitive fish made their grand entrance among aquatic animals. Primitive fish that would later give rise to a major revolution in the world of life. The Acanthodians gave rise to the Osteichthyans, or bony fish, which in turn gave rise to the Sarcopterygians. These in turn gave rise to the Crossopterygians. All these groups may not mean much to you, as they're pretty hard names to remember, but you should know that during the Devonian period, the Crossopterygians gave rise to the first tetrapods, which you may be more familiar with, since this large group includes, for example, dinosaurs and birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. But that's another period, another story, another journey through time.